Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, hundreds of Hamas and Islamic Jihad rockets continue to rain down indiscriminately on Israel, Israel responding with hundreds of targeted airstrikes. Meanwhile, protests, both peaceful and violent, continue to erupt across the country between Arabs and Jews. And finally, yet another disaster befalling Haredi Jews as a section of bleachers collapses in a makeshift synagogue on Sunday, killing two. Over a week has now passed since the conflict between Israel and Gaza intensified into war. Over 3,500 rockets and counting launched towards Israeli civilian communities, killing 12 and injuring hundreds. And the IDF, for its part, responding with crushing airstrikes targeting Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Operation Guardian of the Walls continuing full force for, quote, as long as is necessary, according to Israeli authorities. Officials in Jerusalem rejecting earlier calls for ceasefire in favor of punishing Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists with, quote, severe consequences for the over 3,500 rockets fired towards Israel. 12 Israelis as of this reading, including 2 children, the elderly, and disabled civilians falling victim to the 10% of rockets that do make it past the Iron Dome defense systems. Again, however, Israel, for its part, responding harshly to Gaza's indiscriminate attacks.
סיימתי עכשיו הערכת מצב ואישור תוכניות מבצעיות עם שר הביטחון, הרמטכ"ל, ראש השב"כ, ראש המוסד וראש המל"ל. ההנחיה היא להמשיך להכות במטרות הטרור. צה"ל עושה זאת היטב. היום הוא חיסל עוד מפקד בכיר של הג'יהאד האסלאמי. פגענו ביחידה הימית של החמאס, וגם ממשיכים להכות בתווך התת-קרקעי במטרו של החמאס. ויש עוד מטרות. אנחנו נמשיך לפעול ככל שידרש כדי להשיב את השקט והביטחון לכל תושבי ישראל.
The IDF claiming to have confirmed already killing over 150 terrorist operatives in Gaza as of Tuesday morning, including top commanding officers. And this as part of the dozens of ongoing airstrikes against terrorist infrastructure in the Strip, which is heavily embedded in civilian surroundings. Most notably, the destruction of an AP and Al Jazeera media building that was allegedly also used by Hamas terror operatives for military intelligence, weapons development, and storage of advanced weapons. Israel likewise rejecting criticisms of targeting the media, in that they notified all media personnel long before the strikes, just as they do in every other part of the Strip where civilians are used as human shields by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and no civilian casualties were reported in those strikes. The Hamas Health Ministry in Gaza still claiming over 200 deaths, however, including at least 50 minors. And while many civilian deaths in Gaza are unfortunately accurate, it is unclear how complete these numbers are, as Hamas has been known to obfuscate death tolls by inflating numbers and by reporting all deaths, militant or otherwise, as civilian. Now joining me with more on the ongoing crisis between Israel and Gaza, fellow with the Jewish People Policy Institute, or JISS, and expert on Israel and Middle East security, IDF Reserves Major Dan Pfefferman, and former commander of the Tel Aviv Air Force Base, Brigadier General in the Reserves, Israel Relik Shafir. Thank you both so much for being with us. Now, how does Israel confirm terror targets when mixed with civilian targets? Dan, I'll start with you.
Sure. So there's a process by which the IDF goes through assuring targets. First of all, it has to have clear and hard intelligence before it confirms strike targets. There's a process where the commanders, strategists, international law experts, and intelligence officers are all sitting together to look at both the operational worth of a target, but also the legal and moral aspects of it. And there's also windows, strike windows, when you can, when you can't, and everything is taken into account. The efficacy of the potential strike versus the risks of taking such a strike, and each one is taken into careful consideration before the IDF proceeds with executing that strike.
Well, so going to you, Relik, there have been many casualties reported in Gaza, allegedly over 60 civilians, including many children. Meanwhile, we know that Israel makes phone calls, uses roof knockers, drops leaflets, and other such operations to minimize civilian casualties. But if Israel goes through all of these hoops, how are there so many casualties, and how does Israel hit its targets if it's also giving advance notice ahead of all these strikes?
Well, I think we should ask how do we have such few casualties rather than how many? I'll give you an example. The metro system, so-called metro system, the underground tunnels that Hamas uses, when we target an area that could be clear of any civilians and hit the tunnels may cave in and inflict damage on buildings under which it passes hundreds of meters away. Now, the buildings may have poor infrastructure to begin with, cement infrastructure, but they're weakened by the tunnels that go underneath those buildings when the explosion does take place. So this is a collateral damage that you cannot know ahead of time. But Hamas, when they built those tunnels, this is exactly what they wanted, was to safeguard those tunnels under the buildings. Other examples, they fire rockets from civilian areas. So just think of a pilot who's targeting now a missile which is set to go off against Ashdod or Ashkelon or Tel Aviv. It has it at its sight, and it can take it away and prevent that missile from firing. Obviously, he will bomb that target. But if that missile is launched from an area that close by there may be civilians hiding in a building, then the result is that Hamas, in its actions and in its tactics, actually is committing atrocities against its own people. We know that had taken place quite a few times. I don't know what the spread of the casualties between the different happenings are, but I can assure you that none of the pilots who released weapons will do so knowingly if there are involved civilians in the area that might be hurt.
All right, now I want to follow up with you, Relik. What is the best way, because we have Netanyahu saying that we're going to continue this operation until we've hit what we want to hit, until we've made Hamas regret starting this latest escalation. How far is far enough? What will it take to keep Hamas from violence long term? Is that military necessarily, or is there some sort of incentive that maybe can be used?
I think militarily, if we carry on in this operation for a while, that will either deter Hamas or lengthen the time span that we can keep them under control, just like from the 2014 operation. But if goodwill on Israel's side, the Arab countries, some of the Arab countries that we have befriended in the last year or two, the European community, create a program with Egypt that gives the Palestinians in Gaza a ray of hope of building their lives other than fighting, then we will have a tit-for-tat offer to Gaza, so that they will have an option to look at the bright side of things rather than just another war. So this will take a lot of goodwill, stamina, and a coalition between some of the countries that are not usually on best of terms, such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, etc. And there had been a floating idea of having the Gaza Strip stretched out to El Arish along the northern Sinai. So there are ideas floating around that need some push, that are a kind of I would say, the carrot side of things rather than the whip. So I think there are things out there, and I think maybe this particular campaign will be an impetus to use them as something to give the Gazans some hope, and they do deserve some hope.
All right, now we'll be right back with you, Relik and Dan. But meanwhile, As the IDF is battling Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad to the south, attacks are emanating from the northern and eastern Israeli borders with Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan as well. At least 2 rocket volleys, a possible attack drone of yet unknown origin, and several attempts to breach Israeli territory reported along these edges in just the last few days. And returning to discuss, fellow with the Jewish People Policy Institute and expert on Israeli and Middle East security, IDF Reserves Major Dan Pfefferman, and former commander of the Tel Aviv Air Force Base, Brigadier General in Reserves, Relek Shafir. Dan, back with you. Is Hezbollah, Syria, other Iranian proxies, are they getting ready to escalate in the north, or is this mostly just individual unrest?
It doesn't seem like Hezbollah itself would be wanting to escalate. From everything I've understood, these are possibly rogue Palestinian organizations that are based in Lebanon, that are based in Syria. Now, of course, nobody operates from southern Lebanon without Hezbollah's at least turning a very willful blind eye to what's happening. And so this could be a way for Hezbollah, for Lebanon, for Syria, wherever the attacks are coming from, to release some steam to show that they are supporting the Palestinians without getting involved, sort of a way to distance themselves without actually escalating, but signaling that they are a part of the effort. They at least sympathize with the effort. And it's very hard for me to imagine that Hezbollah at this time would want to get deeply involved in this conflict.
How many new and long-standing, for that matter, peace deals and agreements between Israel and, say, Jordan, or for that matter now with the UAE and Egypt, Bahrain, etc., are they at risk over this conflict?
Every time there are tensions, these relationships can be put at risk. I think it's telling to see the difference in what we're seeing from the street, the popular unrest, versus what the regimes are or aren't saying. And I think that's where we need to look positively at what's happening, the role or the potential role of the governments in the region. Egypt and Jordan are not overtly attacking Israel for its retaliatory efforts in Gaza. Our new friends in the Gulf as well. They, I think, have a much clearer understanding of who Hamas is and the threat that Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood elements pose to stability in the region. We have a lot more work to do with the public, with the people of the region who don't quite understand this dynamic, who naturally are going to want to be sympathetic to their brethren in Gaza. And of course, the images coming out there are not easy, no matter which side you're on. And it's very understandable to see the rage and the emotion coming from these streets. If one thing does show us is that with Jordan, and not just these incidents, but everything that led up to it, the instability in East Jerusalem, in the Old City, we need, in the events of the last couple of years, the icy relationship with Jordan, I think we need to invest a lot more in rebuilding the trust with the kingdom, with Amman, and learning how to work together again to de-escalate tensions and build up moderates in the region.
Okay, Relek, I have to ask you one last thing. The Iron Dome system, we know that it has an efficacy rate of 90%, but that the latest volleys have been overpowering it just because of their sheer volume. Is the IDF, is the Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow system, are they enough if this war does expand?
Okay, let's we can take this apart. The Arrow system, that is used against intercontinental ballistic missiles, such as from Iran or those that come from outer space, has a much higher kill ability, and it's of course much costlier than the Iron Dome, and it is planned against munitions that can cause a lot of damage. This is why we need a much higher percentage of probability of hits. The Iron Dome was built around the 90% effectivity, and I think it proves itself right. Every life, either an Israeli or a Gazan life, is God-given and is sacred. But if you look at effectivity of the Iron Dome, it's been able to take 90%. True 10% have entered our space, but the cost of going to 100% would mean that we cannot afford to shoot at all the incoming missiles, and that means that there's a balance that of effectiveness that it's so expensive to go over 90%, close to 100, that it's, as I may say, not worth the effort or the money, because there would be a lot fewer of those. So I think we'll have to live with a 90% ability.
Wow.
And take into account that in spite of all the damage done, the main damage is psychological rather than material.
All right. Relik Shafir, Dan Pfefferman, thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, in other news, the international community at large is still primarily bashing Israeli forces for defending Israeli civilians while attacking terror groups in Gaza. Most critics drawing false moral equivalence, arguing that Israel is in the wrong because the death toll is unbalanced, as Israel has a stronger military and the Iron Dome defense system. Joining me with more, Jewish-Israeli rights activist Rudy Ruckman, and fellow with the Jewish People Policy Institute and host of the Jewinst podcast, Reserves Major Dan Pfefferman. Thank you both again for being with us. Rudy, I'll start with you now. I've heard now from several leading voices, including from news anchors, celebrities, popular satirists like Trevor Noah and John Oliver, that Israel is guilty of responding too harshly, of disproportionality, despite Hamas's stated goal of destroying Israel and killing Jews. How do you respond?
Well, you have to have the context. It's not only important to understand the what, but the why, because if you truly want to change the what, you have to understand why it's happening in the first place. The reality is that Hamas is shooting rockets onto Israeli civilians and using their civilian population, which is very dense and populated in Gaza, as human shields and shooting rockets from those areas. Israel is warning before they shoot back. And of course, when we look at the death tolls on either sides of civilians, even one person dying is horrible. But to take the context out of it and to manipulate it to create political ammunition to make one side good versus one side bad is allowing this conflict to continue and to continue pushing these zero-sum game realities where there's only one side that's going to succeed is also false. There is no future where Palestinians disappear. There's no future where Israelis disappear. So who's really profiting from this, if not the Israeli people and the Palestinian people? Well, we have to look at also who's right now in control and in power. If we look at the Palestinian Authority, they were supposed to have an election this week, which all of a sudden is no longer a conversation. Hamas all of a sudden is a favorable party that before this operation or this clash, war, conflict, whatever one wants to call it, was less relevant. Now they're more in power. They're more likely to, maybe if there's a new election, to be taken into account. Also, the Israeli government is on its fourth election, possibly going to a fifth election soon. No coalition is being built. No government is being built. So I think we have to ask ourselves the question, who's really profiting? Is it the weapons companies in the US that profit from conflict? Are there medias? Are there other countries? Are there people in politics? Because it's definitely not the people on the ground.
All right, Dan, I'd like your response on this as well.
Sure. I see this a lot, and I spend a lot of time on my platforms trying to respond to this as a former military officer. I think, first of all, it comes from a place of ignorance of how militaries work, how wars are waged. And I think what we need to do is as Israel supporters, responding to this is bring the question back to them. First, we need to be talking not about disproportionate levels of force, because this is not some kind of football match where people like Trevor Noah and John Oliver, who are very intelligent people and have huge platforms for a reason, they want to see some sort of football match where the score is fairly even till the end. We need to be talking about a disproportionality of intentions, not of capabilities. And here, once we can talk about that, it should be very clear who is the aggressor and who is the defender in this case. And what we need to do whenever these accusations arise, is the greatest extent possible, is ask them, what would you do differently? What do you think Israel should do differently than it's doing now? Because the concept of proportionality in war and use of force has to do with using no more force than is necessary to achieve your goals. So there's clearly a disconnect, an ignorance, a misunderstanding of how militaries operate. And as of right now, the Israeli military is the only Western military fighting for a democratic country that's fighting on such a scale and having its military conflict in the press. And so we seem to be the only ones who have to deal with this. But this should, we don't need to yell, we don't need to shout, we do need to engage in education and in dialogue with such people to talk about concepts of war, to talk about how aims and strategies are achieved. And if they're so wise in this, what would they be doing differently that we aren't doing now? I certainly would be glad to know.
Rudy, similar, it seems that everyone worldwide basically has an opinion on this conflict, on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, even when many, if not most, seem to be missing key details or willfully ignore them, or they conflate what's going on with Gaza with what's going on with Jerusalem when they aren't necessarily conflated per se. What would be your message to all the people who suddenly have an opinion on this or feel very strongly on this topic, even when they don't necessarily, quote unquote, have skin in the game?
I think there are two different messages. There are messages for foreigners that don't have any sort of connection to the land. And the message to them is, if you want to invest your energy, invest in bringing the people together, not in dividing us, not in manipulating our suffering, not in taking things out of context, and trying to help us come together. Because again, like I said, there's no reality where either population disappears. So if you want to be a quote unquote activist and do something to help the people, if you truly care about Palestinians or truly care about Israelis, don't pin us against each other and don't use our pain for your own political gain. Now, if it comes to the Israelis and the Palestinians, whether living in the land or outside, if we invested our energy more in speaking to each other and understanding each other's identities, experiences, sufferings, aspirations, rather than investing it in speaking to the rest of the world to demonize the other side, which happens on both sides, then actually we would be able to come together. And I think there's a big problem that within the Palestinian community, they haven't understood that using terrorism is not something that works. So terrorism can be used as a form of, as an anti-colonial tool. So for example, a lot of Jews, Jewish militant paramilitary groups before 48 were terrorizing the British, making the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation. And according to official British documents, they left because of Jewish terrorism. So you can use terrorism against a military group in order for them to leave. However, when you use an anti-colonial tool like terrorism against a native people, an indigenous people like the Jewish people, who just happens to be 100 times stronger, they're going to respond 100 times stronger. So to intifada, to try to shake off, whether physically or intellectually or psychologically, a native people, it just will never happen. So I think we need to change tactics and have a larger conversation once this war settles of how do we proceed? How do we create a reality that actually fulfills justice for both peoples? And yes, I do think there should be a lot of responsibility held by Israel, because the reality is that today Israel is in power. So although we're not responsible for why we are here, we are responsible to take that into consideration in order to build something to move forward.
All right, now, Rudy, Dan, thank you both so much for being with us. Changing tune now, yet another altogether avoidable disaster befalling the Jews of Israel during what was supposed to be a celebration. 2 Israelis killed and dozens more injured over the Shavuot holiday as rows of makeshift bleachers collapsed under worshippers in a Givat Zev synagogue. Hannah Rifkin reporting.
Hundreds gathering in the town of Givat Zev on Sunday, just outside Jerusalem. The crowds gathering in a small makeshift synagogue to celebrate the Shavuot holiday. But the evening ending in disaster as a 12-year-old boy and a 40-year-old man were killed, and dozens more were injured in a terrible structural collapse. To make matters worse, the incident just a few weeks after the tragedy at Mount Meron was similarly avoidable. Organizers at the event likewise allegedly warned in advance that the building as a whole was unfinished and unfit to hold crowds. And in fact, more to the point, the collapse occurring as hundreds of parishioners danced atop wooden makeshift bleachers, negligently attached with iron wire and zip ties to the existing stairs in the hall. Witnesses saying even children were involved with the bleachers' hasty construction.
הכל עם תפסנות, עם חוטי ברזל. אין שום דבר לא מחובר או קשור אחד לשני, אין ברגים, הכל עם תפסנות, עם חוטים של בניין. זה כל התוספת בנייה שנפלה.
We wish all the victims of this incident a speedy recovery.
All right, that's it for today's news. For more of the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as to our newsletter, iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well. Thank you so much for watching.